some interesting terrain. We've, in previous papers, touched on Freud and Foucault. We've gone to the reproduction of archival photos in a weekend newspaper. We've considered the cultural archive constructed by exiled compatriots. We've looked at the spectral, touched briefly on it, touched briefly on the emotional, and even had a small foray into the archives of pain and pleasure. And giving you a sense of this terrain also provides an opportunity for me to advertise to you next week's paper by Martin Hall, an archaeologist from UCT, who moves well beyond archaeology to engage in a paper called Blackbirds and Black Butterflies, to engage digital technology, the making of the archive, and identity, and the possibility of a reworking of questions of identity in the face of digital technology. So I really think that's an exciting paper, and of course you're all invited. Now today takes us in yet another new direction, and to set us on course we've invited two people to open our discussion. Firstly, we'll have Dr. Sue van Zyl, who is probably without question our faculty's most interdisciplinary scholar. You know her as someone who teaches in applied English and also in psychology, and who has a very special interest in Foucault. She'll give us an input, and we've said to each of these inputs strictly 15 minutes. You can time them and see how they do. And then we'll have Verne Harris, who's Deputy Director in the National Archives. He describes himself as more of a bureaucrat than a professional archivist, and I'm uncertain about both of those because, in fact, he's educated as an historian. He served part-time on the ANC's Archives Committee before 1994. He's been employed part-time as a consultant by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he's published 2 novels, both shortlisted for the Mnet Book Prize, but both, he admits sadly, commercial failures. Now, both of our commentators will focus their remarks on the book Archive Fever, and then we'll invite Professor Derrida to respond. And after that, it's open to discussion and to comment from all of you. So I want to remind you then that this session focuses on Archive Fever and is in fact part of the seminar series Refiguring the Archive, and we would like to keep that focus in our discussion. So Sue van Zyl, over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I am, in fact, particularly interested in Foucault, but I'm really interested in Freud. But as they both begin with F, I will forgive you. So I'm going to talk largely today about what I regard as the crucial psychoanalytic intersection between Archive Fever and questions of the archive and psychoanalysis. When Carolyn asked me to comment in his presence on a work by Jacques Derrida, the arch-patriarch of deconstruction and one of the most influential thinkers of our times, I was, as you can imagine, both honored and terrified. While the sense of honor remains, the sense of terror has been somewhat dampened by the support of a small group of fellow readers of Derrida on Freud, especially Andreas Bertoldi, Saul Tobias, and Ulrike Kistner, whom I want to thank from the outset. I also want to thank Henry Louis Gates, opening speaker of the seminar series, for reminding us that nobody can be said to have understood anything unless they could have explained it to their grandmother. Now, while I agree with him entirely, I must confess that Archive Fever is one of those texts that makes me extremely glad I no longer have any grandmothers. At the outset, it seems to me clear that Archive Fever makes a major contribution to the seminar because it demonstrates that if we are to understand how and why the archive might reconfigure itself, we must turn not only to the inevitable surface vicissitudes of history, power, and knowledge, but also to what, as post-Freudians, we know of the depths of its subject, the archivist. But let me hastily add, Derrida's is not a psychological contribution to an understanding of the archive. His is not, of course, the by now commonplace understanding that the archive is often at the mercy of the needs and interests of individual archivists. In Derrida's hands, the productivity of the archive's encounter with psychoanalysis stems from his demonstration that the apparent unities of the archive are always threatened by those very forces and effects which Freud has shown continually threaten the psychological unity of the archivist. This enterprise, it seems to me, is rooted in two related assumptions concerning the relevance of Freud to questions of the archive. The first is that the psychoanalytic archive in particular, dominated as it is by the signature of Sigmund Freud, is an especially rich site in which to uncover conflicting principles of authority and theories of origin still actively at work in all archives today. The second is that psychoanalysis itself is an archival science, one unceasingly concerned with questions of memory and forgetting, with the necessary and accidental destinies of desire and thought, and the substrates which sustain and obliterate them. In an attempt to give some focus to the few comments I have time to make, and I won't go on long, I will begin where Derrida begins. Archive fever opens with an etymological analysis of the term archive, from which Derrida generates what I take to be three ingredients central to the concept. While the contemporary meaning of the word emphasizes its sequential dimensions, its Greek and Latin origins signal the archive status as a place from which authority emanates, a place where legal documents were stored and preserved. The concept of the archive is thus a temporal, a juridical, and a material one, and it is to the dynamic principles at work in each of these, to classic questions of time, space, and power, located at the point of intersection between archive and archivist, that archive fever makes its seminal contribution. Turning first to the question of authority, one of the terms which threads its way throughout Derrida's text is the word patriarch or archpatriarch, a term which signals a concern with which the power which those who appear to found the archive, or the family for that matter, have over those which follow them. In archive fever, three important sets of relations to authority are evoked: those of Freud to his father Jacques, those of contemporary historian Joseph Chaim Yerushalmi, author of Freud's Moses, Judaism, Terminable and Interminable, to Freud, and finally those of Jacques Derrida himself to both Yerushalmi and Freud. The first of these two pairs is examined primarily through the lens of Yerushalmi's key question as to whether psychoanalysis is a Jewish science, or more precisely, the question of whether Freud thought it was, one in turn seen as inseparable from that of Freud's own relation to his Jewishness. The last of these pairs is ever present, but only referred to explicitly in one sentence, in which Derrida writes that if he were immodest, he would say that in speaking of Yerushalmi, he were also speaking of himself. As the text of Archive Fever unfolds, it becomes apparent that the heart of this question is a contradiction, one which reveals itself in the two very different forms in which the archivist Yerushalmi attempts to answer it. The first way is that of the conventional modern historian, revealed in the manner in which Yerushalmi seeks and treats evidence. A key example discussed is a family Bible which Jacob Freud recovered and reinscribed to give to his son Zygmunt on his 35th birthday. A piece of evidence Yerushalmi used to show, for example, that Freud knew more Hebrew and more of the Bible than he sometimes implied he did. The second is something very different. It is the concluding 19-page section of Yerushalmi's book entitled Monologue with Freud, a section which lies at the heart of Derrida's text. The monologue, Derrida points out, represents a substantial change from the classical style of the rest of the book. Up to this time, Yerushalmi had complied with the traditional norms of objective knowledge and scholarship which dominate every scientific community. But he concludes in a new mode. In the fictive monologue, he breaks the historian's code and enters into conversation with Freud's ghost, addressing him as you and questioning him directly. What is more, having asked Freud whether his daughter Anna spoke in his name when she said that if psychoanalysis were to be described as a Jewish science, it would be a title of honor, he promises, in defiance of all archive injunctions, to keep Freud secret and not to reveal his answer to anyone. What strikes me with increasing force when reading Freud's Moses and Archive Fever is Derrida's demonstration that a deconstruction of Yerushalmi's book reveals no less a point than that which lies at the heart of the Western historical archive. The form of the monologue and the use of Freud's Bible, respectively, reveal two concepts of truth: that backed by the personal authority represented by the word of the patriarch, in contrast to that founded on the demand for objective evidence represented in documents able to be separated from any particular voice or people. While the first may seem to have been superseded and almost obliterated by the second, it is only a matter of seeming. As Freud and Derrida both know, the role of patriarch continues to reveal itself in the psyche of the archivist. Obedience may be deferred, but it is obedience nevertheless. In fact, Derrida's treatment of deferred obedience marks for me a key characteristic of his reading of psychoanalysis, an orientation towards what is most radical in Freud. Ambivalence to authority, reflected so often in the deferred obedience of those who record and make history, can of course be explained by way of Oedipus. In Oedipal terms, it is necessary to draw attention to the fact that freedom from the father is ironically brought only by way of identifications with him. But this is not the route Derrida takes. Freud offers us another, for many far more problematic explanation of deferred obedience, the phylogenetic account, which sees the inherited memory of the murder of the primal father and the subsequent complicit banding together of the brothers as a source of an archaic psychic constellation latent in all members of the species. This constellation, the importance of which later Freud continually emphasizes, not only accounts for the power of the patriarch and the ambivalence of the sons, but acts as the precondition for the social bond itself. The very possibility of the archive, and thus of a history of culture, is rooted in traces of phylogenetic memory. But this commitment to the power of the phylogenetic archive is not limited in Freud or in archive fever to the forces which surround the patriarch in the making of history. Its dynamic psychic work is complemented by an always implicit and often explicit epistemological correlate. It underpins a crucial distinction between what Freud called, somewhat misleadingly for our purposes, historical, that is, collective, unconscious, phylogenetic truth, and material, that is, actual, individual, ontogenetic truth. To quote Derrida and Yerushalmi, Freud may have rejected the Bible's material truth, but not its historical truth. In fact, just such a distinction probably informs Derrida's own reading of Freud's famous analysis of Jensen's novel Gradiva. Jensen's Gradiva is a story of the archaeologist Hanold, who, despite his rational archaeological knowledge, sets out for Pompeii to find the woman whose unusual gait he believed acted as inspiration for the figure on an ancient frieze with which he has become fascinated. In Pompeii, he meets and talks for 2 hours with a woman he takes for a ghost, but whom he later recognizes with her help is his childhood sweetheart Zoe, whose distinctive high step evoked that figure on the frieze. Derrida's reading of Freud's reading of Jensen emphasizes the piece of the story that resists explanation. Faced by Hanold's symptoms, Freud marshals the entire etiological machinery of psychoanalysis, beginning with the mechanisms of repression. But in the end, for Derrida at least, it is the truth of insanity, of hauntedness, which returns, because it too belongs to some spectral, historical, not just material truth, which Freud's archive, perhaps despite itself, cannot do without. But if Derrida and Freud together trouble our understanding of the archive with questions of authority and truth, Derrida is equally merciless when it comes to ideas around time and the sequential. Lest we think of it as available to completion, Derrida repeatedly reminds us that the archive is always open to more archival material, is always open to what he calls the future to come. There are many meanings of this phrase in the book, but 2 seem central, neither of which finally have to do with the provisional nature of all scientific work, because new archives can be discovered, may emerge from the merely private or even from the actively secret sphere. For example, when Yerushalmi asks whether we shall ever know whether psychoanalysis is a Jewish science, because so much will depend on how these terms are defined in the future, he is surely pointing to more than a possible change in the meaning of words. He is raising, in fact, a fundamental question concerning the future of historiography itself, in which the possible relations between language, science, nation, and religion may be construed quite differently. Presenting the question of the future to come in different terms, Derrida revisits his own and Freud's attempt to represent memory as internal archivization by way of the mystic pad or the child's magic slate, and then raises the question, ironically the only one that is on the cover of the Archive Fever book, of the informatic culture and the archive. Freud did not have the possible models to represent the functioning of the psychic apparatus those archival machines available now, machines which could hardly have been dreamt of in the earlier part of the century, represent? Do these new machines change anything? Do they, Derrida asks, affect the essentials of Freud's discourse? It is at least possible, he suggests, to question whether the structure of the psychic apparatus as a system of memory and forgetting resists the archival technosciences or not. Is the psychic apparatus better represented by mechanisms more complex than the mystic pad, by microcomputing and so on? What would the effect on the psychoanalytic archive have been if, instead of all those remarkable but time-consuming letters, Freud and his colleagues had communicated by way of email? These are not issues which Derrida addresses in Archive Fever, although he confesses he would like to have. What he does make clear, however, is that it is important not to confuse, as many in my opinion do, changes in our capacity to represent the psychic apparatus with alterations in the psychic apparatus itself. For, as Derrida writes, if we encountered changes in terms of spatial architecture or economy of speed, it would no longer be a question of the representative value of the model, but rather of an entirely different logic. This indeed would be an illustration of the future of the power of the future to come on the archive. Turning perhaps too late to the title of the text, I'm once again struck by what is central to Archive Fever and to Derrida's commitment and capacity to work at the limits of the material. That psychoanalysis is a science of memory, of unwanted remembering and active forgetting on the individual level is of undoubted importance to what Freud has to contribute to an understanding of the archive. But once again, Derrida chooses the strongest hypothesis available and reminds us that psychoanalysis is also a science of the death instinct, of that which dies and is destroyed, even while it celebrates that which survives. Early in the text, Derrida raises the central idea of the death drive by way of a reading of the opening of section 6 of Freud's Civilization and Discontents, in which he points to the paradox at the heart of Freud's archival gesture, because Freud's labors in the interests of the archive invoke that very principle which aims to ruin it as an accumulation of memory in some exterior place. With the death drive, Freud introduces, in Derrida's terms, an a priori forgetfulness into the heart of the monument, that which works against itself, a principle that threatens every principality and archive fever. With Derrida and Freud, then, the archive appears before us as that driven by the eternal warring between eros and thanatos, in a fever provoked by the principle of death, but defended, like the sick body, by all that the life force can marshal against it. Archive fever marks that place which continued to hold Freud and all those who have followed him in thrall, the place of the symptom at the heart of the sublimation. So, Professor Derrida, may I ask you, despite all those no doubt deliberate equivocations in the theses which end Archive Fever, am I right in assuming that Sigmund Freud contributed to the archive, cleft as it is, survives the deconstruction especially well, and that, as Western metaphysicians go, he is amongst the least metaphysical of them all? But in such a forum of this, there can be no whispering in the ear, so I cannot, of course, promise not to reveal your answer to anyone.
I think we realized it was getting a little close for you all, and that's why we've opened the doors. And I think it was a welcome breath of air. For you, the speakers, if having a little noise behind you is distracting, you should just close the doors. So please do that if you need to. But I think for the rest, I hope you'll bear with any slight distraction, but I think the air is welcome. Now, it's a great pleasure to have Verne Harris do the next input for us. And I think it's a sort of a remarkable moment, the moment when a university like Wits and an institution like the National Archives can truly work in a partnership to open up a field of inquiry. So great pleasure now to ask Verne to give us a few comments.
Concern for my own archivability demands that I begin with 5 warning signals. I've read far more writings about Professor Derrida than by him. I've read considerably more writings by archivists than by philosophers. It was only on my 3rd reading of Archive Fever that I began to dispense with dictionaries and to discern the enchanting coherence of Derrida's argument. I find Jung far more compelling than Freud. And finally, for me, deconstruction has as much to do with passion, even religion, the yearning of and for soul, as it does with scholarly or intellectual endeavor. Derrida had flirted with the idea of the archive before 1994. In Archive Fever, he engaged it in a lingering embrace. The text of a lecture he gave at a colloquium on the 5th of June 1994 in London, Archive Fever sacrifices none of the density characteristic of his other work. His stated objective is the positing of theses which define the impression left by the Freudian signature. He arrives there via an extended foreplay. His moves are at once heavy and light, focused and multi-layered. They are always deliberately and self-reflectively complex. No word or term is safe from the passion of Derrida's embrace. And no Derridian gesture is without a flourish of new terms. He demands of the reader a reciprocal commitment. Consummation is inconceivable without a willingness to play and replay Derrida's moves, which makes one wonder how it must have been for that audience on the 5th of June 1994. Derrida's moves in epistemological space offer nothing which is new to postmodernist discourse. He has covered this ground before, as have Foucault, Lyotard, and others. But his focus on the archives brings a freshness to his fundamental assertions. I want to signpost 4 of them. 1, the event, the origin, the arche, in its uniqueness, is irrecoverable, unfindable. In Derrida's words, the possibility of the archiving trace. This simple possibility can only divide the uniqueness. 2, the archiving trace, the archive, is not simply a recording, a reflection, an image of the event. It shapes the event. To quote again, the archivization produces as much as it records the event. 3, the object does not speak for itself. In interrogating and interpreting the object, the archive, scholars inscribe their own interpretation into it. The interpretation has no metatextual authority. There is no meta-archive. There is no closing of the archive. As Derrida puts it, it opens out of the future. And then fourthly, scholars can never be exterior to their objects. They are marked before they interrogate the markings, and this pre-impression shapes their interrogation. This last assertion Derrida buttresses through analysis of Joseph Yerushalmi's book, Freud's Moses. As Sue has already indicated, Yerushalmi concludes with a 30-page fictional address to Freud. Up to this monologue, Derrida points out, Yerushalmi presents himself as an historian exterior to his object. He is neither Jew nor psychoanalyst as such. But in the monologue, he demonstrates this exteriority to be a chimera. He is Jewish, and his discourse bears a Freudian pre-impression. Ironically, one of Yerushalmi's intentions in the monologue is to posit the pre-impression of Jewishness on Freud. He asks the question, is psychoanalysis a Jewish science? And seeks to demonstrate that Freud believed that it was, but secretly. He never allowed this belief to become a part of the public archive. Derrida uses this as a platform for probing at Freud's discomfort with the influence of his own marking on his work. And in doing so, Derrida is, I think, marking the shadow of another related question: is deconstruction a Jewish science? Nothing is less reliable, Derrida asserts, nothing is less clear today than the word archive. Nothing is thus more troubled and more troubling today than the concept archived in this word archive. In fact, Derrida argues, we do not have a concept for the word. All we have is a notion, an impression associated with the word. And the very process of archiving, the structure of archivization, will not allow it to be otherwise. Derrida's positing of the notion begins with a lexicon, an archive of the word archive. He demonstrates how in the original Greek usage, it is inseparable from the idea of consignation. The marking on a substrate through impression on paper, through circumcision on the human body, implies both process, the power of consignation, and place, the place of consignation. Control of consignation, the exercise of a toponomological archontic power, is at the heart of political power. For South Africans, it takes only a slight jiggling of memory to recall the obsessive guarding, patrolling, and manipulating of consignation by apartheid's archons. Unfortunately, Derrida's lexicon is restricted to the Greeks and the Romans. He offers no analysis of developments over more than 2 millennia. He declines to acknowledge archives as a discipline, one with its own discourses and histories. In a sense, Professor, I'm glad of this, because if you had, I fear you might have been driven to death by boredom. Nevertheless, the question remains, was this deliberate or instinctive, archontic or anarchontic? And while Derrida describes the impact of the computer on archivization as an archival earthquake, he does not explore how virtual electronic records have dizzied the archons and transformed how we conceptualize the place of consignation. What he does explore, drawing heavily and explicitly on Freud, is the anarchontic instinct of destruction at work within consignation. Aside from deliberate erasure, and here I think it worth footnoting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's exposure of the apartheid state's systematic and large-scale destruction of records in the period 1990 to 1994. Apart then from deliberate erasure, there is an instinct of forgetfulness, a death drive indissociable from memorization. To quote from the book, the archives take place at the place of originary and structural breakdown of memory. The archive, in other words, always works against itself. This is the archive fever of the book's title. Moreover, Derrida points out, Freud made possible the idea of a substrate which cannot be reduced to memory. That is, memory as conscious reserve or as active recalling. Freud gave us the tools to expose repressed or suppressed or super-repressed texts, attested to by symptoms, signs, figures, and so on. We must, Derrida concludes, reconceptualize the archive to accommodate this archive of the virtual. Another footnote, in so many of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's hearings, we have seen symptoms of suppression and have seen often clumsy attempts to expose the suppressed virtual archive. This conjuring of virtual space, of spectrality within the archive, together with the idea of the death drive in archiving, establish what Derrida calls a Freudian theory of the archive, a theory which we must take account of and account for. Not that psychoanalysis offers us a concept of the archive, or even a means of resolving the contradiction, the unreliability inherent in the concept. Indeed, Derrida argues, in analyzing the trouble de l'archive, psychoanalysis succeeds only in heightening it, for it repeats the very thing it resists or which it makes its object. In the theses, the culmination of archive fever's foreplay, Derrida unfolds the internal division in Freud's discourse on the archive. Interpreting Freud on the archive is but one thread in the tapestry of archive fever. The central thrust of Derrida's argument is that the archive as concept is cleft, contradictory, always dislocating itself because it is never one with itself. But that far from being reason for despair, this is the very strength, the future of the archive. One need not share Derrida's particular presuppositions and perspectives to recognize the accuracy of the diagnosis. Intrinsically unstable, rather dynamic, the archive is being turned inside out by postmodernist epistemologies and technological revolution. And here in South Africa, it awaits, it needs urgently, a turning inside out by epistemologies which we might label African or indigenous. But there is convincing evidence, none more so than in the work of Terry Cook and other heralds of a post-custodial era, that it is keeping its head above the troubled waters. Derrida's own exposition of the trouble de l'archive, in my view, demands serious consideration. Let me rephrase that. One doesn't respond to a playful seduction nor a feverish coming on by considering it seriously. It demands a hot or a heated response. Of course, braving the trouble de Derrida is no easy ride, and resolution, climax, is not guaranteed. pleasures are. For me, as an archivist, three stand out, and I shall conclude with these. Firstly, a compelling demonstration that we are in need of archives. To quote John Caputo on Archive Fever, the book, "The living past cannot rise up from the dead and speak to us like dead stones. We must pick our way among the remains, wrestle with and conjure the ghosts of the past, ply them with patient importunity in order to reconstruct the best story we can." As an aside, I want to suggest that this statement of Caputo's could so easily have been made, probably in effect has been made, by every one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's researchers and investigators. Secondly, an equally compelling demonstration that this need for archives should be embraced with passion. Archive fever, the idea, should not render us cynical and arid. On the contrary, it is invitation to enchantment, to the play of ecstasy and pain, as we exercise that immemorial passion for the impossible. A passion which plays out in a waiting for a coming, more precisely in the inciting of a coming to come. A passion which is both response to and unfolding of the archive's messianic dimension. And thirdly and lastly, a devastating rebuttal of the notion long cherished by archivists that in contextualizing text they are revealing meaning, resolving mystery, closing the archive. Derrida demonstrates that at best archival contextualization reveals the multiple layers of construction in text, and in doing so adds yet another layer. Properly conceived, archival contextualization, archival endeavor as a whole, should be about the releasing of meanings, the tending of mystery, the opening of the archive. Thanks very much.
But there's a tricky question now, is will the National Archives still collect? So much for the local heroes. Now it's our pleasure to have our distinguished guest to comment in any way you would like to, both on the commentaries that have gone before, on our larger project, and indeed on your book and all the things that constellate around it. So over to you, Jacques Derrida.
Thank you. Well, I won't tell you, I'm unable to tell you how pleased I am and honored to be here with you and to thank my guests here and Caroline Hamilton to start with. I won't tell you how pleased I am because I'm not pleased. I'm absolutely paralyzed by the situation. I'm happy to see so many people, but I thought it would be a seminar with questions and improvisation and so on and so forth. And now, after these very generous and lucid accounts and critiques, I am in a position to go back to the book, and I've totally forgotten the book. Almost totally. I brought it with me, and I thought that perhaps at some time I could just consult the. And this is, I say this sincerely because I tried yesterday, because I wanted to prepare this improvised session. I tried to read it, and I couldn't do it, and I was thinking that the choice you've made of this modest essay, it was a lecture, in fact. I will tell you more about the archive of this lecture in a moment. I thought that your choice of this lecture would have to do with precisely the questions that were addressed, in fact, by you, that is the current situation of the archive in this country, the challenge of memory, the reference to the past, the TRC, and so on and so forth. So I was just preparing myself to address, not my book, and to plead for my book, but just to address a question and to share with you a number of concerns. So let me try and say something about the book, but I hope that very quickly we'll leave the book and just discuss burning things here. About the lecture, just to describe the limits of this essay, which was a short book I wrote in a very peculiar situation in this part of the book as archive. It was a conference in London organized by the people in charge of Freud's archive and close to the house of Freud in London. And preparing this lecture about memory in psychoanalysis, the relation, and you've said this very well, I won't go back to this, about the memory, the unconscious, the technology of archive in psychoanalysis and after psychoanalysis, I, knowing that Yerushalmi, the famous historian of Judaism, would be here, having written this book on Freud and Judaism, I oriented everything I had to say in his direction. I wanted to pay homage to him while, of course, discussing his book. And what happened was this. First failure, something which is being repeated all the time around this problem. That Yerushalmi, whom I met the day before the lecture, didn't come the day because he was sick. He stayed at his hotel, so I had to just to pay homage to him, to discuss him while he was not here. It was a very strange situation. Something like today. Well, I wasn't exactly prepared to what's happening. And then, of course, I sent him the manuscript. He read the manuscript. He wrote to me very generously. And then we met in New York. We became close friends. And last fall, people in New York wanted to organize a real debate, a public debate like this, between him and myself. There was a crowd, and it was a total failure. Because that time he tried to reply in a very aggressive way. I was totally paralyzed by the situation, and nothing happened once more. So there must be a fate here around this. Let me go back to some of the points which were made by Susan Van Zyl and Verne Harris. Some of them, because what they have said, I agree almost about everything they said, and I don't want to repeat this. Let me simply insist on a question that they haven't emphasized about Judaism. It's not simply a question of Judaism itself, but a certain difference within Yerushalmi's book between what he calls Judaism and Jewishness. And this has to do with the question of the future. The archive as being not simply a recording of the past, but also something which is shaped by a certain power, a selective power, and shaped by the future interior. Yerushalmi says that at some point in his fictional debate, and of course the fiction is an important point here, in his fictional debate with the ghost of Freud, he says that, of course, he would easily give up everything in Judaism except what he considers to be Jewishness, the Jewishness, that is what is the essential feature of being a Jewish, which has nothing to do, or nothing essential to do with religion, belief in God, tradition, etc., etc., but simply, he says, the constitutional reference to the past, which he thinks is essentially Jewish and inscribed in Jewish texts, and another essential and unique relation to the future, as if Jewishness was characterized by precisely this double relationship to the past, the law of gathering and being true to the past, and the promise, the future. And I, discussing, of course, objecting to this definition, and to this, at least to the attribution only to Jewishness of this double desire for the past and for the future, I, of course, discussed a number of, let's say, political implications, historical and political implications of this definition of Jewishness in Yerushalmi. And this has to do with, of course, a point that you, both of you, have correctly emphasized, that is, the archive doesn't simply record the past. It also, of course, constitutes the past. And in view of a future which retrospectively or retroactively gives it its so-called final truth. And in that respect, I, of course, take into account Freud's gesture. Freud, that's what the major contribution to Freud, and I think something to which deconstruction will be forever, say, indebted to him, is Freud's contribution consists in saying that the psyche is structured in a way that there are many places in which traces are kept, which means that within the psyche there is an inside and outside. First. So since the archive doesn't consist simply in remembering, in a living memory, in anamnesis, but in consigning, in inscribing a trace in some exterior location. There is no archive without some location. There is some space outside. Archive is not the living memory. It's a location. That's why the political power of the archont is so essential in the definition of the archive. So that you need the exteriority of the place in order to get something archived. Now, because of this exteriority, what is kept in the archive, of course, can be erased, can be lost, and the very gesture which consists in keeping safe, in a safe, so to speak, is always and from the beginning threatened by the possibility of destruction. That's one point. The other point is that the possibility of the destruction of the archive, and we could give examples, as burning is the one you gave, about the destruction of archive in this country, of actual or potential archive. The destruction of archive is not simply a risk which is run because of this exteriority, and the fact that it's beyond, it's located in a place which by definition is threatened. The risk has to do with what Freud defines as a death drive. That is a drive to precisely destroy the trace. without any reminder, without any trace, without any ashes. So on the one hand, you have a device, a structure in which what is repressed, that is forgotten in trivial sense, is kept safe in another location of the psychic apparatus. Okay? And in this economy of repression, nothing is lost. Okay? What is forgotten or repressed is kept safe somewhere else, and then in some situation, the repressed can be, of course, can come back. And of course, we can not only illustrate this, but we'll confirm this through a number of historical and political examples. But this economy, and this is an economy, according to which nothing is annihilated or destroyed forever, this economy is, let's say, threatened or in conflict with the uneconomic death drive. That is, a drive which motivates, so to speak, the radical destruction of the archive. That is, a destruction which doesn't leave anything in place, which is even more radical than repression. It's the repetition of a possibility of, let's say, burning into ashes the very trace of the past. So that's what I call, in archive fever, the archiviolytic power, the power to destroy the archive. Now, which means that the limitation of the archive, the fact that the power and often the social and political power of the archive, which consists in selecting the traces of memory, in marginalizing, censoring, destroying such and such traces through precisely a selection, a filter, and which, of course, is a selection which is made possible by, let's say, the finitude, the limitation of, let's say, human power, of space, the place where to accumulate the archive and so on and so on. And we have a number of such problems today of the economy of the accumulation. That's finitude. But this finitude doesn't account for another kind of destruction, which is the death drive. That is, the radical desire for the destruction of the archive is incommensurable with the finitude of, let's say, the power of man, the human power to keep in a certain space a certain amount of accumulated traces. So you have here a conflict or a competition between the consequences of finitude and a radical drive to destruction. And it is because this radical drive to destruction is always at work, and that we have to take account of it, that the desire for archive is a burning one. If we knew that it's only because of the limitations in time and space, because of the technological limits that we cannot keep this or this, there would not be such a fever, a passion. You said that there is no need for archive without no archive to be embraced without passion. There would be no passion. If there is a passion, it's because we know that not only the traces can be lost by accident or because the space is finite or the time is finite, but because we know that something in us, so to speak, something in the psychic apparatus is driven to destroy the trace without any reminder. And that's where the archive fever comes from. Now, a question that I was asking, I'll make two more points, and then if you want, we'll open a discussion with the audience. Two more points. One has to do with technology, and the question you raised about the history of technology after the etymology of the word archive and archon and so on and so forth. You're right. I didn't really take into account the whole history of technology and in details what's going on today. Nevertheless, I tried to address the question not simply of the progress of the technology today and the consequences it may have on the work of the archivists and of all kinds, political, archaeological scholars and so on and so forth. I also asked the question whether psychoanalysis itself should not be transformed by the transformation of these writing or archiving apparatuses. Not at all as if, let's say, psychoanalysis being what it is, the mutation, the technological mutation, could have changed the record we keep of psychoanalysis, or could have changed something in the way we archive the results of psychoanalysis, or the way we archive the history of psychoanalytic institution and scholarship. No, my assumption was that the mutation in technology changes not simply the archiving process, but what is archivable. That is, the content of what has to be archived is changed by the technology. That is, and this has also a number of political implications. That is, the way we experience what we want to keep in memory or in archive, and the two things are different, is conditioned by a certain state or a certain structure of the possibility of archiving. So the archive, the power, the technological power of the archive determines what has to be, the nature of what has to be archived. Then, of course, for that reason, because the content and the meaning of the archive is constantly reshaped by the archivists of all sorts, and not only the scholars, everyone in the city which takes part in this process. The structure and the meaning of the archive is, of course, dependent on the future, on what is coming, on what will have come. And here I would like to say one more word about what you correctly recalled about what I call messianicity. The problem of messianicity is, of course, at the center of my discussion of Yerushalmi's thesis. What I call the messianic, of course, the messianicity is not reducible to what one calls messianism in religious traditions. That is, it's irreducible to a determined figure of the Messiah in a number of Jewish, Christian, or Islamic traditions. What I call the messianic here is simply the relation to the future, the expectation of what comes with no horizon of expectation. Anything might happen or arrive. And this openness, this relation to the future is a universal experience. It's not reserved to cultures in which the Messiah appeared as a determined name and figure. So for that reason, there is a messianicity implied in the very experience of the archive. And that's also why it is impossible to close the archive. It is impossible to saturate a context in which we could say, well, now it's done. We have gathered all the documents and monuments. We know how to interpret it. We have all the contextual elements necessary for that, and it's done. No, it's always possible to reinterpret an archive. And this future-oriented structure of the archive is precisely what confronts us with a responsibility, an ethical and political responsibility. Now, of course, I know that today what South Africa is experiencing is, from that point of view, on the one hand, unique, and we'll come back to this probably, and on the other hand, very analogous to a number of situations today in the world. I could give a number of examples in Europe or out of Europe of the same problem of the archive of what happened during, let's say, the last century, not to say more than that. In France, we have our problems too from that point of view. Now, I've been constantly, even before coming here, but especially since I arrived here, constantly thinking of and meditating on and discussing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. On the one hand, we could say that it is a problem of archive, that is, the Commission is trying to gather a number of testimonies and to make them public, and that's another feature of the archive. There is no, in the strict sense of the word, there is no private archive. An archive has to be public, even if it's hidden provisionally or appropriated by someone. It belongs to the concept of the archive that it be public, precisely because it is located. It is, you cannot keep an archive inside yourself. This is an archive. Because of the exteriority that I mentioned at the beginning, an archive has to be public. Now the TRC could be considered a place of archive. That is, a number of testimonies are gathered, and there is a recording of it. I understand it's often publicly broadcasted by the media. Then there will be books, reports. It's going to be a public archive, and the very publicity, the inscription of the public space of these testimonies and these interpretations of the testimonies will have, no doubt, a powerful effect on the history and the future of South Africa. Difficult to know what this effect is or will be, but no doubt the act of the project of the archive and of the inscription of the archive in the public space to make it available publicly, not simply in South Africa, but all over the world, will have powerful effects. Now, as you know, very well, this commission is very controversial for many reasons. I don't know if we can, perhaps we'll come back to this in a moment. But one of the reasons that I would select here, because of the theme of this seminar, is on the one hand the limitation, the selection. And on many sides, many people could complain about these limitations. No, not everyone can testify. Not everyone, because not everyone living, but there are a number of people who are dead who cannot testify. So there is active and passive selection. I won't enter into the details here, but you can imagine how selective the process has to be. It cannot be otherwise, if only because of the limitation in time. And this commission, and by contract, and you can easily understand why, had a limited space of time, period of time, to gather these testimonies. This is a serious limitation, but they had to limit themselves, if only because the work of mourning, which is at the center of this experience, a work of mourning, Freud would say, has to be limited in time. If you want a work of mourning to be efficient, it has to come to an end at some point. And then there are other deadlines and the report and the elections, so a number of such limitations. For some of them, some responsibility can be assigned, of course. It's a decision made by a determined people who decided this and this, about these limitations. But in addition to these, let's say, decided or calculable limitations, there is an uncalculable limitation. That is that the archive, some archive, has been forever destroyed, not simply as documents, but simply people have disappeared. And the pain or the violence on many sides cannot be recorded in an archive. The destruction of the archive was part of the painful things that are in question here. The destruction of the archive was precisely the problem. There is the disappearance, the death, the killing, or the forgetting, or simply the impossibility just to attest to or to testify what happened. So there was a radical destruction at the center of the experience to be recorded, to be archived, so to speak. Then there is another problem, of course, that this archive is not simply a mass of facts, of true facts, to be gathered and delivered and made available. They are interpreted facts, interpreted by the witnesses, of course. A testimony is not simply the unveiling of a truth. A testimony is an active interpretation of what happened. So the concept of truth in Truth and Reconciliation, in that case, doesn't simply mean that information. Because there is interpretation, there will be interpretation. And now the way the commissioners, the people in charge, the people who have the power, in fact, to build the archive and to publish the archive and to interpret the archive, have, of course, their own interpretation, their own motivations, their own pre-shaped schemes of interpretation. For instance, if you interpret reconciliation as conditioned by confession, repentance, forgiveness, and so on and so forth, then you introduce within the very text of the archive a number of, let's say, values or assumptions which are linked to, let's say, for instance, not only religious beliefs, for example, forgiveness, reconciliation, salvation, redemption, and so on and so forth, but within such or such religion, you introduce an interpretation of the religious tradition itself. That's what I tried to say modestly in lectures I gave before coming here on forgiveness. An act of forgiveness, pure forgiveness, usually in the Christian tradition, which is dominant in the ideology of this unique and exemplary process. An act of forgiveness should be conditioned by confession. That is, the one who asks for amnesty, for forgiveness as amnesty, should ask for forgiveness, that is, repent, confess, transform himself or herself, and so on and so forth. That's the traditional interpretation of forgiveness. But I would say that in the same tradition, you may interpret forgiveness in a very different way and say, well, forgiveness has nothing to do with asking for forgiveness, with this economy of confession, repentance, and so on and so forth. Forgiveness, if it happens, should be totally foreign to this economy of asking for forgiveness, to the conditional economy, and into the horizon of redemption, salvation, even reconciliation. Now, the very concept of truth, let me be quick now because I don't want to. I told you at the beginning I was paralyzed, and I'm seeing that I can't stop speaking. The very concept of truth, which is on the one hand at the center of the work of an archivist. The archivist wants to, and Freud gives us striking examples in the text I quote, wants to establish the truth. Okay? That's what it was. Okay? And the way it was, and beyond my interpretation, that's the stones speak, as Freud said. That the truth is not simply the historical truth in Freud's sense, but it is the truth itself, the thing itself which speaks the truth. So on the one hand, the archivist looks for the truth, and on the other hand, the commission in question, for understandable political reasons, looks for the truth, considering that the truth is the condition for a reconciliation, that is, making the truth public would be the condition for precisely a, let's say, political, therapeutical healing away of a number of wounds from which this country and these nations in this country suffer. So, but the truth in that context is not objective truth, it's not scientific truth. It's the truth according to which St. Augustine, for instance, would say that when I confess, when I make the truth, as he says, when I make the truth, I don't simply inform God or the others, because God knows. When I confess, I'm not informing the other of what I've been doing, but I confess I was guilty, and I, through an act of love, call the others to love God, and so on and so forth. So the truth in that case is not simply an objective, theoretical act of knowledge. The truth has to do with, in that case, confession, with a transformation of the subject. And I think that if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is so interesting today, not only crucial for this country, whatever follows from it, it's to me unpredictable. It's crucial for this country, not because of what is at stake, obviously at stake, but because it forces one to ask questions such as, and it is the lesson has to be drawn not only by South Africans, but by everyone in the world who observes what's going on here, to ask questions such as, what is an archive today? The archive of the evil, the archive of traumatisms, and so on and so forth. And the archive of the repression of the archive of the destruction of the archive. And we had a number of examples in this century, not only in South Africa. So questions such as, what is the archive as including the destruction of the archive, including forgetting? And what is the truth in that case? What has the truth to do with politics and with the recovering of a nation and the reconciliation and so on and so forth? Now, just one last point. Even in the case of, let's say, by hypothesis, a successful archive, even if you really succeed in gathering everything you need in reference to the past, and that you interpret it in a way which is totally satisfactory, then we'll have here a full archive, correctly interpreted, and no one would disagree on the truth and the fidelity of this archive. Everything is now kept safe, and everyone agrees on that. So we'll keep this archive safe. Okay? Now, because of that, because of this, the very fullness, hypothetical fullness of this archive, what will have been granted is not memory, is not a true memory. It will be forgetting. That is, the archive, the good one, produces memory but produces forgetting at the same time. And when we write, when we archive, when we trace, and we leave a trace behind us, and that's what we do each time we trace something, even each time we speak. That is, we leave a trace which becomes independent of its origin, of the movement of its utterance. The trace is at the same time the memory, the archive, and the erasure, the repression, the forgetting of what it is supposed to keep safe. That's why for all these reasons, the work of the archivist is not simply a work of memory. It's a work of mourning. It's a work of mourning, and a work of mourning, as everyone knows, is a work of memory, but also the best way just to forget the other, to keep the other in oneself, to keep it safe, in a safe, but a safe, when you put something in a safe, it's just in order to be able to forget it, okay? When I handwrite something on a piece of paper, I put it in my pocket or in the safe, it's just in order to forget it, to know that I can't find it again while in the meantime having forgotten it. Okay? If there is pure forgetting, it's because the archive should be, in order to be safe in a safe, should be external to me. Okay? So suppose that one day South Africa would have accomplished a perfect, full archive of its whole history, not simply apartheid, but what came before apartheid, and before, and so on and so forth, and the full history. Suppose that such a thing might be possible. Of course, it is impossible. Let us suppose it's possible. Everyone in this country, who are interested in this country, would be eager to put this in such a safe that everyone could just forget it. Okay? And perhaps this is the unconfessed desire of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that as soon as possible, the future generation may have simply forgotten it. Okay? Having kept everything in the academy, in the libraries, in the hands of remarkable archivists, okay? Just let us forget it to go on, to survive. That's what we are constantly doing. We just archive against memory. Well, I think I should stop here. Thank you.
I'm a bit worried about those of you who've been standing all this while, and if you do need to come and sit in the front, please take this opportunity to do it, and 1 or 2 people are leaving, so do get a seat. Because we've got people in the other room watching on the screen, it's important that we, as far as possible, try and use the roving microphone. It's at the end of the table. And what I will do, if I can, is identify 1 or 2 speakers in advance and ask you to just watch who they are and make sure that the mic gets to them while responses are happening. So that will be the mechanism by which we go. And we have 1 mic on that table and 1 here, and I'll leave it to anyone who wants to respond to choose whether they want to use this one or that mic. And we'll just take 1 minute. Won't you signal those of you who want to speak in a quick order? We'll go Claudia and then Windsor and then James. So those 2 over there on the table, if you can pass the mic down while some people are leaving, that will help. Down the table on the front here. Is that mic coming? Right. Our technicians, we still got a technician. Try it.
Is that better? Yeah.
That's it.
I've been following the Truth Commission process pretty closely and really grappling with these issues around memory and forgetting, and also the ethics of the process. Coupled with the political constraints, recognizing perfectly well what those constraints were, how the discourse and the laws around the Truth Commission has been shaped in terms of, instead of examining crimes committed by the apartheid state and the agents of the state and investigating crimes against humanity and prosecuting crimes against humanity, we've hedged, and we now have a discourse that seems to equate both sides of the political spectrum, examining gross human rights violations on both sides. And there's a profound relativism at work in that, implicit in the act.
Please,
sorry, there's
more slowly and louder, because
there's a very strong relativism at work that says that the acts perpetrated on both sides of the apartheid struggle, for apartheid and against apartheid, are equated. And there's a profound loss of memory that operates immediately in the act. And I, over the last couple of years, have been very troubled by the way people apologetic defenses for apartheid ideology, and indeed for the crimes committed by agents of apartheid, have adopted deconstruction as their explanation for their justifications, such that you have the National Party going to the Truth Commission and refusing to give any kind of evidence as to what they authorized, what in fact they were responsible for.
That's what they call deconstruction?
No. But simply offered their perspective on the past, said they were there to explain and to offer a perspective and to simply to provide their interpretation, so that what has happened is not so much an affirmation of truth and of historical objectivity, but using notions of multiplicity of interpretations, multiplicity of truths, to justify the refusal actually to even affirm a truth. And I'm just wondering if perhaps you could speak to that tension.
Okay, now, just to remind you to keep that microphone moving. So to Windsor and then to James standing over there.
Thank you. Now, of course, here is one example of a problematic interpretation, because in your question or remark, you are just assuming and interpreting deconstruction as relativism, multiplicity of interpretation, and so on and so forth. And of course, I find this absolutely problematic. Deconstruction, if there is such a thing, is not relativistic, and it's not simply doesn't consist simply in taking in multiplying interpretations, in taking account of multiplicity of interpretations. Many other philosophies or movements have taken into account the possible multiplicity of interpretation. So I don't recognize the deconstruction in this picture. But now, it is interesting that some people anywhere say, well, as soon as someone abuses or strategically exploits such relativism, such multiplicity of possible interpretations, then that's deconstruction or deconstructivists are responsible for that. That's, and I would like to testify, if it is and to complain about this injustice. This is, but of course, I cannot convince you or convince anyone briefly without asking for some more homework. And then you would see that deconstruction is something else than simply this relativistic activity. But it's not the first time that this happens. I remember, if I may recall this, I remember when I was in the United States 4 or 5 years ago, giving a seminar, at the very moment when the Rodney King affair, perhaps you know what it is, okay? This long trial during which the attorneys of the policeman try to analyze the archive precisely, that is the film, the record, the tape of the film which this young man had, having a camera, had made at the moment when the policeman was beating this young black man in California. And some people said, well, you see, what this attorney is doing, trying to analyze every second in the film. Think, well, at the moment when the so-called victim tried to react or even to do whatever he did to the policeman was not beating him, okay? So there was an enormous, endless discussion about a second in the movement of the bodies as they were precisely archivized by this improvised cameraman, okay? And people say, well, this attorney used deconstruction. So then I was implicitly, charged with being on the side of the police, of the, let's say, no, there is something in the interpretation. Excuse me, you want to say something?
I'm not accusing you of defending apartheid apologetics. I'm simply trying to
I
make...
hope not.
No, really not the point. I'm trying for myself to separate out precisely what you're saying, how the kind of abuse of certain forms of discourse is used for political ends. Mm-hmm. I think I wasn't clear enough in my point. I'm really interested in how, in a way, those kind of apologetics exemplify the death wish. Mm. So that where that kind of the multiplicity of interpretations can be about memory rather than mourning, what we're seeing here is a mourning process in work that doesn't allow the work of memory.
No, I understand. I was not charging you either. I was just trying to give a form to the debate. In fact, everyone can use a deconstructive style and make it a weapon in a given debate. It is always possible. And that's why everyone has a responsibility in precisely analyzing the use and the abuse and to see at what point these people in favor of apartheid use a deconstructive device in order just to apologize or to let's say dissolve the charge. Now, nevertheless, the very premises of this commission give, of course, offer themselves to a very, very difficult interpretation. Because, of course, if the protocol of the commission says that they would simply put on the same level crimes in the name of apartheid and crimes or killings or violences in the struggle against apartheid. This is already a very problematic interpretation. That's why many people react, and rightly so, I would say. But why is it so? It's because at the center of this axiomatic, they refer to the archive of this concept called crime against humanity. As you know, the concept of crime against humanity is a very new concept. It is not a natural given. It has a history. It was produced by a court after the war, during the Nuremberg trial, and it is in the name of precisely this concept, crime against humanity, that a number of actions and trials have been organized. And today, the concept of the rights of man is indissociable from the concept of crime against humanity. So what is a crime against humanity? I think this concept was a progress. I have nothing against the progress that this concept. Nevertheless, it remains a very problematic concept. Very, very problematic. And I hope that one day it will be refined, and because every crime as a crime is a crime against humanity. Yeah. What is a crime against humanity? Now, once you refer to this concept of crime against humanity as a concept which was coined and performed and institutionalized rather recently, then you level all the crimes said to be political. As far as I understand, the criminal assassination today is not part of the let's say the agenda of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's only violences with political motivations. Now, once you take this axiom for granted, of course, many people may say, well, on the one hand, of course, we were not guilty because we were fighting against apartheid. But on the other hand, well, we were simply fighting for a cause, a political cause, and we were given orders, political orders, and so the guilt might be neutralized. So there is a whole space of interpretation opened by precisely these two sets of axioms. And in order to distinguish between a legitimate recourse to interpretation, the one who testifies or the one who listens to the testimony, both of them can say, well, I can interpret. This can be interpreted, okay? And there is an interpretation possible. You can't deny the right to interpret. Then you have to interpret the interpretation and to discern between some legitimate one, some abuse. If I say, well, I was not guilty for having done this and this, I won't give examples, because I was given the order, or because the cause of apartheid was considered legitimate. So that's the responsibility. This will be the responsibility of everyone to decide what is an abusive interpretation and what is not. And finally, the conclusion will be, rightly or wrongly, let's say, a decision between at least two interpretations. At the end, we won't have the naked truth. We'll have the most convincing, that is the most powerful interpretation. Today, it is this. In the given situation, post-apartheid situation, this interpretation will be this one. Suppose that there would have been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission during the apartheid. Let's dream, okay? You can imagine everything would have been different, and the conclusions would have been, the report would have been different. This doesn't mean relativism. This means that there are responsibilities, there is a transformation, there are, let's say, decisions to be made, sides to be taken, and of course, the people who are against apartheid, for a number of principles and reasons that I won't recall here, will have a reading of this commission, of the results of this commission, which will be very different from the people who still believe in apartheid. And no one, at the end, will be able to make a final, to produce a final consensus. So there will be a conflict of interpretations. And there is no archive which could be decisive, which could reach some point beyond interpretation. And saying this is not a relativistic stand. I could try and argue this much longer, but I wouldn't think that this point is a relativistic or empiricist one.
Hi, my name is Windsor, Social Department at Wits University. I've got 4 points which are somehow questions concerning what you've said this afternoon. The first one is, and this is what I sense from Susan and Mr. Harris, and you also, there's a sense in which there was no articulation of the language that constitutes the archive. I think there was a talk about the archive as something somehow reified at one level, at a level something which is political, social, and socially constituted in terms of authority figures. But I didn't get a sense of what is the language that's involved in archival process, archival practices, and what is that language specifically. And I think that language can be anything in terms of its content, but I'm concerned about it can be anything in terms of its content. It can be French, it can be Afrikaans, it can be English, it can be Zulu, whatever. But I'm more concerned about the notion of language implicit in the process of archival practice. I think that's something I want to get clarity on, because that is linked to the whole question of the self-deconstruction of the archive. Something that you seem to be alluding to this afternoon, meaning that certain forces seems to lead to the deconstruction of the archives. You mentioned the limits of the archive from the failure to accumulate enough information, people are dead, and so forth. But at the same time, the sense in which the archive is limited in terms of thanatos, the death instinct. And I think that for me is important in terms of the language that is implicit in the deconstruction of the archive. So I want to link that into that point. The second question.
Let me respond one by one.
Sure.
So what is the first question?
The question is the language which constitutes the archive. Yeah. I'm trying to understand what is your notion of the language that constitutes the archive.
Well, of course, you're right. There is no archive without the signature of the archivist. Is it archivist or archivist? By signature of the archivist, I mean the individual signature of the person in charge, but the signature of the apparatus, the people, and the institution which produces the archive. This signature is a language. The archivist doesn't simply perceive the document, doesn't simply receive the document. It organizes it, it produces it in a certain way, and this production implies the language on the part of the archivist. Now, the language is not simply here the idiom, that is the verbal national language, although it plays a role, because to go back for a moment to the TRC, as you know, as well as in your parliament, you have 11, 12, 13 languages have to be translated first, and the translation must, of course, transform the testimony. testimony as a singular performative act is essentially embodied in a singular idiom. So to translate the whole archive into English, I suppose that the prevailing language in the report and the available books will be English, or I don't know, perhaps there will be 11 or 12 or 13 translations, but throughout the world it will be read in English, I can assure you. So this hegemony of the English is a problem about the interpretation of the testimonies, which at the beginning, originally were not performed in English first. And then, even in the meta-language, so to speak, of the TRC, that is, the language through which the people responsible for the TRC defined the task of the TRC, they used some notions which are problematic when you shift from one language to another. The notion of forgiveness, of repentance. I know I'm incompetent, but I know that in some African languages, it is difficult to translate rigorously such a notion. But there is another, according to such or such culture, African culture, there is another cultural set of meanings around what Desmond Tutu calls repentance or forgiveness. So in that case, the very axioms in which the TRC is shaped from the beginning implies a linguistic intervention. And this is the condition. It's not simply negative. There are some negative effects. But without these risks, there would be no project of any archive. But we have to remember that there are such risks. So the language is at the beginning of the very project of the very institution of the archive, not to speak of many other possible linguistic interventions.
Given that, that's why I was going to ask you about the notion of the death instinct. Given that the death instinct, or the death drive, given that language is central to the archive, at what level is the death instinct develop or emerge in the whole process? Because if we take the death instincts from Freud and link that to language itself, and in South Africa, the TRC is conceptualized in terms of a social practice, a political practice. How does the death instinct emerge into the TRC to deconstruct the whole process of searching for the truth, searching for meaning, and so forth?
I try to interpret, so that's the right word, I think, to interpret what I call archive fever by reference to this death drive. Not only, but mainly by reference to death drive. And I think the death drive is at work at least in two ways. One is the drive to destroy the very memory, the very trace, and the very testimony of the violence, of the murder. The perpetrator tries not only to kill, but to erase the memory of the killing. That is to act in such a way that no archive is left. And we have experienced this in mass murders here or in Europe, and so we know that the perpetrators, sometimes in an industrial way, in a massive way, try to kill not simply their victims, but the memory of the victim, the names of the victim, to erase the names of the victim. That's one effect of a radical death drive. Now, another paradoxical effect appears on the opposite side. That is, when, in order to oppose the destruction, you want to keep safe, that is, to accumulate the archive as such, not simply living memory, because you don't trust living memory, you trust the archive. Now, the gesture, which consists in accumulating the archive in the monumental document, is another way, as I said earlier, of producing forgetting. That is, there is a perverse desire for forgetting in the archive itself. The death drive is not simply at work in killing, in producing death, but in trying to save, in a certain way, the memory. And you can't escape the forgetting. And forgetting in that case is not simply repression in psychoanalytical. There is repression in the psychoanalytical sense, but there is more than repression. There is an erasure which doesn't keep the repressed thing in some other place, but which produces forgetting by remembering, so to speak. And you have in many interesting texts, such as Blanchot's, for instance, and others, the suggestion that remembering is forgetting. The accumulation, the capitalization of the archive is, in fact, a destruction of the memory, and thus another symptom, let's say, of the death drive.
I'm going to interrupt here simply to say that those of you who know in the seminar series that it's our objective to ensure that our speakers don't just come and go, but they stay and work with us for as long as possible over the coming decades. I don't want to exhaust our speaker, and we will bring this to an end at 6:30, so that you know that. And then I'd like to ask Windsor's permission to pass the mic on so that we can take some of the other questions. Could you just pass it across to James, who's standing with the sunglasses on his head? And who else needs a question? So then in the front of the table here. So James, when you're finished, if the mic can come forward to the front of the table. Thank you.
Just very briefly, it relates quite closely to the last question in any case, so you might be able to answer it quite briefly. It goes back to the issue of technology and the changing role and proliferation of technology in archival processes and in the process of recording of cultural memory. Now, it's interesting that, you know, the conclusion of your initial response to Sue and Verne, it seemed to me what was most important about your conclusion is that the truth of the archive is the truth of the other, or that's an aspiration for the truth of the archive. And it seems that technologies, particularly digital technologies and recording technologies, and those kind of forms seem to force us into a position which dramatizes quite strongly the play in technology between, or the ambivalence in technology between the death drive and, you know, the death drive through the prosthetic effect of technology and its kind of extension, its instrumentality. You know, a nice acute case in point is Bill Clinton's testimony, where, you know, in anticipation, Bill Clinton is in anticipation.
I haven't forgotten.
But I mean, there are others. The O.J. Simpson trial is also a good kind of high-profile case. But in anticipation of the kind of scientific proof, objective, valid proof of their criminality and infidelity, and respectively, they confess. You know, and Clinton has just done this. And this seems to me and he's doing this. It's a kind of technological mediation of the truth of the other. That is happening there. So, I mean, basically, does that change the nature of rather than simply the content of archival process?
Certainly, no, I can only agree with you on this. Now, I'm constantly, during the 2 weeks I spent here, I was constantly dreaming of the number of places and countries in which a TRC should be instituted. For many, in the United States, would that be possible? Would it be, not simply on the example you... Also, as far as I could see, there is a scene of reconciliation in the family Clinton after the... No, but if you, just 2 points. If today you ask yourself, where and why the institution of such a commission could be impossible, possible or impossible. This could provide you a very interesting, let's say, reading thread, interpreting thread for the analysis of what's going on in the world today. Where the TRC can be used as a laboratory, an exemplary laboratory, where it couldn't take place, and for what reason in the history of the state, in the history of the nation, and so on. So that's just a suggestion. Now, the other point had to do with the definition of the technology, the techne. Where does it start? In my first old essay on Freud and the scene of writing, I tried to show that for Freud, despite his interest in the externality of the psychic apparatus, he was reluctant to consider the illustration of the mystic, what he called the mystic pad, as something more than an illustration, because he wanted to go back to the psychic life itself without any essential intrusion of any technological instrument or prosthesis. It's the question of the prosthesis. Now, the prosthesis is not simply something external and something we could simply dissociate from the living body and the living memory. That's one. Which means that the techne that is not something, let's say, foreign to the body proper. The techne starts as soon as there is a living life. There is some prosthesis at work. So by saying this, by saying that the prosthetic structure is not simply what we call technology, it starts from the beginning. Saying this, I don't want to, of course, homogenize or erase all the technological mutations and the breaks in the history of the technology. Of course, what we are experiencing today in the technology of recording is absolutely heterogeneous to a number of possibilities, earlier possibilities. But these differences, however formidable they may be, are made possible by, let's say, the structure of the body itself, in which the prosthetic is always already here. And the language is prosthetic, not simply instrumental, but prosthesis. The prosthesis is constantly here. So what we have to rethink, I think, here is not simply such serious themes as reconciliation, truth, politics, and so on, is the relation between truth and technology, the relation between forgiveness and technology, the relation between interpretation and technology from the very beginning, from the very origin of it. And and I think that in that purpose, Freud's contribution was at the same time a major one, because the way he described the unconscious, the systemic partition of the psyche and so on, was introducing some prosthetic structure within the living psyche, on the one hand. But on the other hand, this contribution was limited by Freud himself when he wanted constantly to go back to living memory, to the pure present of the trace. I tried in Archive Fever to take two examples of this, the Gradiva, namely, in which what he wants to finally uncover, using the analogy of archaeology, which was one of his favorite analogies. What he wants to rediscover is not simply the monument of the document, the thing itself, the past itself, present, being made present. That is, finally, to cross the work, the archaeological and the archivistic work in order to reach, as a classical philosopher would do, the thing itself as it appeared itself at a certain moment. So there is these conflicting drives in Freud himself. On the one hand, the acknowledging that the techne, the prosthesis, the archive, that is the hypomnesis, as Plato would say, not mneme or anamnesis, but hypomnesis, was really irreducible. I think this is a major contribution, and I think that deconstruction is absolutely indebted to this contribution. And on the other hand, there is a metaphysical resistance to what he was then discovering. Dreaming still of, let's say, being an archaeologist or an archivist who finally discovers the truth of the thing itself, pure and simple. And we have many examples of this. And we cannot, of course, give up this metaphysical dream. Okay. It is in itself irreducible. But it is part of the death drive. That is, once you reach this absolute presence of absolute life without any prosthetic, any techne, any archive, then you have pure life and pure death. Pure life and pure presence is exactly a pure death. So even in the pure desire for absolute truth of life and being in themselves, there is this perversion, this possible perverse repetition of the death drive.
You know, I'm afraid we only have time for another 2 questions. And so what I would like to do is, can we have the mic come across to the front of the table here? I've got one question here, and then I'll take Achille. I'm sorry, Santiago, I had someone else signal. I know otherwise we'll be here all night. And then I'm just going to offer to both our commentators, if they want a last comment, we'll open to them, and then we have to bring it to a close. So if you don't mind, I suggest we take the 2 comments and then come back to you, if we may. And can I ask you to try and make them concise and tailored?
All right. I was just wondering if you could comment on the notion of justice. If there can be any true reconciliation without justice, perhaps just to mention Emmanuel Levinas, and perhaps if you can comment on that, on him, when he writes in one of his essays on Talmudic essays on repentance, that in the face of infinite obligation to the other, one requires at least some sort of material compensation.
Can we pass the mic back and take the second question?
You ended your first presentation with 2 very strong and somewhat troubling statements. And I would be happy if you could come back to them. The first was the impossibility to close the archives. And the second was the possibility and even the desirability to forget. So my first question is, how can one forget if the archive is, so to say, unclosable? Or never closed, or to put it differently, if it cannot be closed.
How can we forget?
Yes. As long as the archive is still open. The second question, which is in fact not a consequence, but it ensues from the first one, is about the possibility to forgive. I wonder if you can expound a little bit on the relationship between forgetting and forgiving. Is it that to forgive, one has to forget first? And since the archive is never closed, does it mean that in fact we can never forgive? If that is the case, what about vengeance, the status of vengeance?
Thank you. Difficult questions. usually I try and distinguish between justice and law, or right, or Recht in German. There is a history of law. There are processes, trials, and legal devices and legal texts and so on. That's the law. And the law, as a history, can be improved, can be criticized, and so on and so forth. It can be deconstructed. But justice is beyond the law. It's not reducible to the legal process or the legal experience. Now, reconciliation, it depends on the way you interpret reconciliation. If by reconciliation you imply, let's say, that we just forget that we're enemies, or just we heal away, as you say, the wounds and become one, not one, but form a possible community again, I don't see a necessary link between reconciliation and justice. You can, and that's why a legal process, and I think that that's why the TRC is at the same time legal and non-legal. It's not a judiciary experience, but there is something judiciary in it, processes of amnesty and so on and so forth. So as a legal or quasi or paralegal process, it can lead, and that's one of its aims, objectives, to some reconciliation, but this has nothing to do, no. It's not reducible to pure justice. Okay? Of course, when I distinguish between pure justice and the law, and when I say these two things are heterogeneous, I don't mean they are dissociable. They are indissociable, because the law refers to justice. The justice to be embodied and determined must take the form of the law. Okay, so there is a link between them, but in their structure they are irreducible to one another. So justice is heterogeneous to the law, and reconciliation, if it's just the reconstitution of a community, of a friendship, the reconstitution of a healthy body of experience, has nothing to do with justice. You can be reconciled, but it's to make arrangements, compromises, negotiations, and peace treaties, or armistice, or ceasefire. There are a number of types of reconciliation. You can experience a number of reconciliations without any justice being involved. Okay? Justice pure and simple. Now, of course, if you want to distinguish an authentic reconciliation, I suppose that's what you have in mind, an authentic reconciliation from, let's say, a practical compromise, then of course this authentic reconciliation would be closer to justice than the compromise. In the same way, if you want to distinguish between, if that's a classical distinction, between peace and amnesty or armistice or ceasefire, then peace as a pure promise of non-violence is closer to justice than ceasefire, for instance. But then you have to distinguish between two ways of becoming peaceful, the peace properly or the ceasefire. And the amnesty is not simply an act of justice. It's something else. Now, as you know, when you make peace, and it is difficult to dissociate peace from authentic reconciliation, when you make peace, you imply the promise of eternal peace, and Kant made this point very strongly. In the very concept of peace, you imply that the war will never start again. So what he calls the eternal peace, treatise of eternal peace, is not simply a peace to which you add the predicate eternal. No, the eternity is included in the concept of peace. Because if you make peace without promising that you will never resume war, it's not a peace, it's a ceasefire. It's an act of war. It's just a suspension of aggressivity. So the same would be true for reconciliation. If you reconcile, so that just in order to go on doing business and surviving and so on, it has nothing to do with justice. If you reconcile forever, if it is possible, with the promise of perpetual peace, then this could require something closer to justice. So it depends on the way you interpret reconciliation. And as you know, in the common language, some people, when they say reconciliation, they mean something very practical, easy, empirical, provisional, and others think of precisely the promise of indefinite friendship and peace. And justice would be on that side. Now, again, once you have distinguished these two poles of concept, these two concepts, you have also to articulate them. They are absolutely heterogeneous to one another, and nevertheless, our responsibility is to articulate one another, to make the law more just, and to make justice more effective. That's the ethical and political responsibility. Now, the second set of questions is as difficult. Logically, you have you made a point in saying if it is impossible to close the archive, I think it is impossible. To get back again to the example of the TRC, the archive will be closed in a certain way. It is closed already, okay? And it will be closed when the public record will be published and available. But as we know, this one will not mean being closed. Everyone will be able to add something, to criticize, to reinterpret. It will be open to infinitely to readings, interpretation, contestation, and so on. So these closure is not a final closure. So your question is very, very pertinent. If the archive is never closed, how can we forget? Given the fact that I said the archive is also an act of forgetting. It is impossible to be sure that an act of forgetting has been successful. Of course, we may forget as soon as we record and keep safe the archive in the safe, but what we think we have forgotten may come back through a number of ways, unpredictable ways. It may come back, it may not come back. It may come back, it may not come back. So because it always may come back, the impossibility of closing the archive is not in contradiction with the possibility to forget because of that. Now, that's why we can forget, but we are never sure that we have forgotten. Okay? There is no final criterion to decide that something has been forgotten. It may have been forgotten for someone at some moment. Then, as you know, the repression may be defeated, or through a number of generations, something which has been forgotten for generations can come back. That's what we experience all the time in modern times. The coming back of the forgotten in many ways. And because the context remains open, that there is history, there is a future for the archive. Now, the last question you posed about forgetting and forgiving is even more difficult for me because I've been constantly during the last year, I would say, and the last weeks, speaking about this distinction between forgetting and forgiving. So I've I have a number of examples and arguments, and I don't know how to choose between them. Let me say this very briefly. Of course, according to the most traditional concept of forgiving that we inherit from a number of traditions, in order to forgive, you should not forget. Okay? So that's, everyone says that. I can forgive only if I remember and if I keep the memory of what I forgive, of the one I forgive and the one and for what I forgive this one. If I forgive simply because I just forgot, it's not forgiveness. It's just something. So there is a sharp and irreducible distinction between forgetting and forgiving. So that in order to forgive, you have not only to remember the violence or the offense and the harm done, the misdeed, but you have to keep it so vivid, so, let's say, active, that you can forgive only in a situation in which forgetting being so much excluded that you have a quasi-hallucination of the violence that you're forgiving. You have to remember vividly. Otherwise, if you forgive only to the extent that the wound has disappeared, that it's less painful, that because there are so many ways of forgetting. You can simply forget the representation of the violence, or you can forget the intensity of the pain. You can simply take a distance. Okay, that's a number of ways of forgetting. To the extent that you forget the crime, you cannot forgive it. What you are doing is, let's say, excusing, acquitting, giving an amnesty. There is a number of ways of doing something else than pure forgiving. So the pure forgiving implies pure memory. That's why a process of reconciliation, as a process of healing away, of healing, of curing and so on, is incompatible with forgiving as such. With a pure act of forgiving, because the healing, with the work of mourning, the therapeutic work implies that you do whatever you can in order to forget, not simply to forget that the violence has taken place, but simply to forget the effects, the suffering, the pain, and so on and so forth, the violence itself, the intensity, the quality of the violence. So if the reconciliation and all that process is conditioned by such a healing, it is perhaps very necessary, and I would have nothing against that under certain conditions, but it has nothing to do with forgiveness. So the distinction between forgiveness and forgetfulness is absolute in the purity of the concept of forgiveness. Now, it is difficult. It is difficult. That's why it's so difficult to forgive, to be sure that you forgive without forgetting. There is the contamination between the two is always a risk, and it's difficult to cancel, to destroy the risk. But the risk is the risk of a contamination between forgiveness and what is not forgiveness. Pardon me? What about vengeance? Oh, that's in principle, punishment, legal penalty, should be foreign to vengeance. That's the principle of the law, of our law, of the law which prevails in our culture. No vengeance. That the justice and the law are established in order to avoid vengeance. Okay. Now it's all the more so, all the more the case with forgiving. forgiveness. Forgiveness is, nothing can be more foreign to vengeance than forgiveness. But there are let's say, thinkers of forgiveness who said, like Hannah Arendt, for instance, or Jankelevich, that you can forgive only something that you could punish. Okay? Not take revenge of. That's something else. Revenge and vengeance, it's another order. But punish, legally punish. That you can forgive only something that you could, in principle, punish. And so there would be a symmetry between punishment and forgiveness. And I would disagree with this. I think that, of course, we may produce some amnesty or an acquittal or remit someone for his guilt on the same level of punishment by simply not punishing him or her, but that's totally foreign to forgiveness. Forgiveness is transcendent to the legal, to the order of the law, to the legal order. So transcendent to punishment. You can punish someone and forgive him. Okay? That's something else. You can, if someone is guilty, you can just apply the law if you think you have to. And the order of forgiveness is singular, secret, foreign to the law, to the legality of the law. So I would disagree with Hannah Arendt when they say that there is a symmetry between punishment and forgiveness. But that's a huge problem. Thank you. Thank you.
I know that many of you have read widely in the works of Professor Derrida and that few of you had touched archive fever. So we really had a big debt to our commentators who got us going on that. And I'd just like to give them the opportunity, if they have a last comment to make on all that has gone, they would be welcome. If you don't feel obliged to. If you do, we'd love you to have a last word as a thank you for your work in getting us going.
I first asked for their forgiveness. I didn't do. I was really paralyzed and under stress at the beginning, and so I didn't do justice to their gift. So thank you.
I don't have a last word. I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody for listening to us, and we've enjoyed the extension of the debate from the archive fever onto issues of contemporary South African questions. I think that's been enormously productive, and I think we should try to do that again, and we should go on. And I do have some ideas as to how that might go on, but I don't think anyone's ready to hear them now. Thank you.
Verne?
Thank you. No comment either. Perhaps just a footnote to the notion of the TRC archive as act of forgetting. The National Archives at the moment is involved in a Byzantine struggle with elements in the TRC and in the Department of Justice around what is going to happen to the TRC records. We believe that they should come straight to the National Archives and that the point of departure should be that they are accessible. Department of Justice and various other elements in the state believe that they should go to the Department of Justice and that the point of departure should be that they are not accessible. So clearly this is an issue which should be debated publicly. Thanks very much.
Phew. So we can all breathe a sigh of relief. They are still collecting in the National Archives, and aggressively at that. Now, Professor Derrida, you know, we have these coming seminars. The next two seminars take on board the question of technology. Soon after that, we have a young student bringing us a paper on the TRC. We're going to combine that with a paper that deals with archival traces, a sliver of a sliver. How can you go? But I would say that we're prepared.
I would love to attend these sessions.
Well, we'll be prepared to forgive you, only because we can't possibly forget. We have a wonderful memory, and I'd like to say thank you very much for that. Thank you. And the final word is that you have a terrific paper next week as well, and you can collect copies of that paper and the program on your way out. And we invite you all to attend. It's been a riveting series, and today, the greatest of all so far. Thank you.